The story of a nation's rebirth is often told in heroic terms, of visionary leaders, of resilient citizens, of grand plans diligently executed. But history is rarely so clean. Sometimes, the machinery of reconstruction is greased with compromise, and the foundations of a new order are laid in shadows. Our subject is one of the most striking paradoxes of the modern era: how Japan, reduced to ashes in 1945, rose to become an economic superpower within a generation. And we must confront an uncomfortable, deeply complex part of that story: the role played by the nation's ancient organized crime syndicates, the Yakuza. This is not a glorification of criminality. It is a psychological, economic, and philosophical examination. We will explore how, in the total collapse of the old Japan, the Yakuza emerged not merely as predators, but as providers of a brutal, pragmatic order. How they became embedded in the very engine of the economic miracle, providing services the official system could not. And how this Faustian bargain ultimately threatened the society it helped build. This is a case study in the dark side of social cohesion, a journey into the gray zone where community, crime, and capitalism intertwine. To understand the Yakuza's rise, we must first comprehend the depth of the void they filled. August 1945 did not bring peace to Japan. It brought a profound, multi-layered nullity. The physical devastation was apocalyptic. Major cities were seas of charcoal and twisted girders. An estimated 3 million lay dead. The economy had ceased to exist. Factories were rubble. The merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the ocean, and the government's financial reserves were gone. But the psychological and spiritual devastation cut even deeper. The Japanese state had been more than a government. It was a totalitarian spiritual entity centered on the divine emperor. Every aspect of life, from education to family conduct, was tied to the national project of imperial destiny. In one radio broadcast, the emperor's voice, heard for the first time, announced surrender. The kokutai, the national polity, shattered. The god was human. The purpose was gone. The hierarchical ladder that every person knew their place on had vanished. This produced a collective trauma we might now term a form of societal dissociation, a loss of narrative, of identity, of basic predictability. Into this psychic and physical vacuum stepped the occupying forces of the Supreme Command for the Allied Powers, SCAP, led by General Douglas MacArthur. Their mission was ambitious: demilitarize, democratize, and reform. They set about drafting a new constitution, breaking up the industrial zaibatsu, and holding war crimes trials. But their focus was on the macro level, the architecture of the new state. They had neither the manpower nor the cultural understanding to manage the micro-level crisis of daily survival in the sprawling, homeless, hungry metropolises. The official rationing system was a catastrophe, providing perhaps a third of the daily caloric needs. Currency was unstable, with hyperinflation making savings worthless. In this absence, the black market, the Yamaguchi, became the real economy. And it was a lawless, desperate, and vibrant space. It was here that the pre-war Yakuza found their moment of radical reinvention. Before the war, they were largely takiya, peddlers and stall keepers at festivals, and bakudo, gamblers, operating on the fringes of society with their own codes of honor and distinctive full-body tattoos. The war had scattered many, but the structure, the rigid hierarchy of oyabon, father role, and koban, child role, remained a potent social template. Men like Yoshio Kodama, a right-wing fixer and procurer for the military, and Kozo Oma, a street-smart gangster in Tokyo's Ginza, saw opportunity in the chaos. They did not just participate in the black markets, they organized them. Kodama, using his wealth and political connections, became a legendary figure, a shadowy broker between the underworld, big business, and politics. Oma took control of the sprawling black markets around Ueno Station, a critical hub for goods flowing from the countryside. He didn't just sell goods, he imposed a system. This system addressed fundamental human needs in a landscape devoid of institutions. The first need was security. The Yamaguchi was a dangerous place, rife with theft and violence. The Yakuza offered shinoba, protection. For a fee, a stall owner would be guaranteed safety. Disputes between a vendor and a customer, or between two vendors, would not be settled by absent police, but by a Yakuza enforcer. His judgment was swift, final, and enforced with fists or blades. This provided a crude but effective form of justice and predictability. The second need was distribution. The Yakuza, with their networks of truck drivers, sailors, and corrupt officials, became the supply chain for essentials: food, medicine, fuel, and later, luxury goods from the American PXs. They were the logistics arm of a nation that had lost its own. Psychologically, this fulfilled a desperate craving for order and community. After cosmic dislocation, the human mind seeks agency and pattern. The Yakuza, with their clear rules, their visible hierarchy, and their predictable, if brutal, enforcement, provided a pattern. They became a perverse substitute for the vanished vertical society. They also cleverly framed their authority in culturally resonant terms. They invoked the concepts of on and giri, the debt of gratitude, and the social obligation to repay it. By providing a service, order, goods, protection, they placed the community in their on. The expected giri was loyalty, silence, and a share of the profits. It was a corrupted, yet deeply understandable, social contract. For many displaced people, veterans with no home to return to, and orphans, the Yakuza gang, or Ika, became a new family, offering belonging where society offered none. Perhaps most tellingly, the occupation authorities initially tolerated, and at times encouraged, this development. SCAP was deeply fearful of the rapid growth of left-wing and communist-led labor unions, which they saw as a new threat to stability. The Yakuza were fiercely nationalist, anti-communist, and adept at using violence for a purpose. There are documented instances where SCAP officials, through Japanese intermediaries, turned a blind eye to Yakuza activities or even used them as a blunt instrument to break strikes and disrupt leftist political organizing. This established a template that would define the next 50 years: the state, or its proxies, outsourcing morally ambiguous or outright violent tasks to the deniable, flexible machinery of the underworld. By the early 1950s, as Japan stabilized and the Korean War boom began, the Yakuza were no longer just gangsters in the ruins. They were an established, semi-legitimate part of the social and economic landscape, poised to help build the new Japan in ways no one could have predicted. The 1950s launched Japan into the period known as the economic miracle, a sustained boom of historically unprecedented scale. The goal was nothing less than national rebirth through industrial might. This required a physical transformation: the pouring of concrete, the laying of steel, the reshaping of the very islands. The construction of the Shinkansen bullet train network, the highways connecting major cities, the dams for power, the airports for a new global age. These were the temples of the new Japan. But a profound obstacle stood in the way: the land itself. Japan's geography and history had created a patchwork of tiny landholdings. The dream of a straight highway or a sprawling airport runway crashed into the reality of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individual owners, each with deep attachment to their small plot. In a culture that exalted surface harmony, above confrontational legalism, the process of voluntary purchase was slow, emotionally fraught, and often impossible. The legal tool of eminent domain was politically toxic and bureaucratically sluggish. For corporations and government ministries on tight schedules, this was an existential crisis of transaction costs: the time, money, and effort required to complete an economic exchange. The Yakuza provided the solution. They became specialists in jiege, land assembly. Their method was a dark art of social engineering and psychological pressure. A developer or a corrupt official within the Ministry of Construction would identify a target area. Initial, above-board offers would be made. The inevitable holdouts: the elderly farmer guarding his family's land for generations, the savvy speculator waiting for a higher price, would then be visited. The visitor was not a lawyer. He was a Yakuza koban, often impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his hair cut short, his demeanor polite but ice-cold. The conversation would be indirect, steeped in implication. What a beautiful persimmon tree your family has tended for so long. It would be a tragedy if it were to sicken and die. Or, your grandson takes the early train to school, does he not? The platforms can be so crowded and dangerous these days. The message was unmistakable. The original offer would suddenly seem not only fair but generous. The Yakuza, in the cold language of economics, were efficiency experts. They reduced paralyzing social and emotional transaction costs through the application of targeted fear. They were the ruthless lubricant in the machine of progress. This role expanded into the control of labor. The construction boom demanded a vast, mobile, and disposable workforce. The Yakuza operated the Taheshi system, labor brokerage. They controlled the gates to the major construction sites. The workers, often from stigmatized groups like the Burakumin, historical outcasts, or ethnic Koreans, were sourced, housed in miserable dormitories, and paid substandard wages, with the Yakuza taking a significant cut. The Yakuza also guaranteed labor peace, which meant violently suppressing any attempt to form unions or strike for better conditions. This model of controlled, exploitative labor flow was essential to keeping costs low and projects on time. The corruption seeped into the highest levels of corporate Japan through the institution of the Sakaya. These were corporate extortionists, almost always Yakuza-connected. A Sakaya would buy a handful of shares in a major corporation like Mitsubishi or Sumitomo. The annual shareholder meeting in Japan was not a raucous debate, but a ceremonial affirmation of wa, a scripted event meant to endorse management's plans unanimously. The Sakaya would stand up. He might threaten to ask embarrassing questions about executive mistresses, hidden pollution scandals, or financial irregularities. To silence him, to preserve the harmony of the event and the company's pristine image, management would pay him a consulting fee or grant his company lucrative contracts. The Yakuza, through the Sakaya, thus became the unofficial regulators of corporate Japan, profiting from the chasm between public facade and private reality. They policed the secrets of the boardroom. The psychological contract with the broader public during this period was one of profound, willful compartmentalization. The miracle was delivering tangible, life-altering prosperity. The three sacred treasures of television, refrigerator, and washing machine became ubiquitous. The narrative was one of national unity, hard work, and harmonious growth. To acknowledge the violent, coercive underbelly of this success would shatter that beautiful story. So, a societal bargain was struck. Yakuza violence was largely contained. It was directed at other Yakuza, at stubborn landowners, at labor organizers, at errant debtors, at people on the margins of respectable, middle-class life. For the salaryman commuting to his office, the Yakuza were a distant, almost cinematic presence, confined to the entertainment and nightlife districts they controlled. They could even be perceived as a kind of alternative authority, maintaining a rough order in the Sakuriba, flourishing places, where the official police were less visible. The system had cleanly compartmentalized its own darkness, and the Yakuza were the keepers of that dark chamber. They were the violent flexibility the rigid, formal system required but could never publicly acknowledge. They were the shadow that proved the intensity of the light. This integration reached its logical and ultimately toxic zenith during the speculative frenzy of the 1980s bubble economy. If the previous decades were about building a real, tangible nation of steel and concrete, the bubble was about the metaphysics of value, a collective belief in ever-rising paper wealth. Land prices in Tokyo famously reached the point where the grounds of the Imperial Palace were said to be worth more than the entire state of California. Stock prices divorced from earnings. The driver was easy credit and a national euphoria, a feeling that Japan had not only caught up, but had invented a new, superior form of capitalism. The Yakuza, perfectly positioned at the nexus of real estate, finance, and political corruption, became central architects and primary beneficiaries of the delirium. Their jiage operations were now purely speculative. Assembling land was no longer for public works, but for flipping to the next buyer in a dizzying pyramid of credit. The profits were so vast they distorted the entire criminal economy. But their infiltration went far deeper, into the very heart of the financial system. They became adept at Zaytech, financial engineering. Using intricate webs of front companies with respectable names, they secured billions of yen in loans from the nation's most prestigious banks. Loan officers, driven by volume targets and a culture of willful ignorance, asked few questions. This capital was then deployed in sophisticated stock manipulation schemes. A Yakuza group would quietly accumulate shares in a small company, then use their media connections and rumor-mongering to pump up the price before dumping the stock on unsuspecting investors. They also dominated the Sarakin business, consumer loan sharking. They would lend to desperate salarymen or small business owners at interest rates exceeding 50% per month, then employ relentless, psychologically devastating tactics to collect, public shaming at a debtor's workplace, threatening phone calls to family members, even kidnapping. The line between underworld and overworld didn't just blur, it evaporated. This was no longer a shadow partnership, but a full merger. Prominent politicians from the long-ruling Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, relied on Yakuza-connected fixers to deliver blocks of votes in their local Koenkai support organizations, to intimidate rivals, and to funnel massive illegal contributions. The construction industry, the primary conduit for political patronage, was a Yakuza-saturated ecosystem. Major general contractors subcontracted to Yakuza-controlled firms for the dirtiest work, creating a cascade of corruption from the ministry down to the construction site. The monster the system had nurtured to handle its distasteful tasks was now in the boardroom, the diet committee room, and the private political club. It was pulling the levers of power. The public's willful ignorance persisted, now supercharged by a tidal wave of apparent wealth. The violent underpinnings were seen as a minor unsavory footnote to a roaring success story, a problem for them. In the worlds of high finance and dirty politics, not for the average person enjoying their company-paid overseas holidays and soaring property portfolio. The symbiosis had become profoundly parasitic, but the host was too intoxicated by its own growth to feel the drain. The entire edifice was built on a foundation of collective delusion and corrupted credit. And delusions, by their nature, cannot sustain themselves forever. When the bubble burst, it would not be a simple market correction. It would be a national reckoning, a cold, hard look into the mirror at the distorted reflection the Yakuza had helped to create. The collapse began not with a bang, but with a slow, sickening deflation in the early 1990s. Land and stock prices didn't crash overnight. They seeped away over years, a process that came to be known as the lost decades. The hidden liabilities of the bubble era surfaced with a vengeance. At the core of the ensuing banking crisis were the trillions of yen in non-performing loans, a staggering portion of which were tied to Yakuza-front companies and speculative projects. The banks, paralyzed by the fear of exposing their criminal connections and admitting their losses, became zombie banks, unable to lend to healthy businesses, thus strangling economic recovery for years. The Yakuza, meanwhile, fought to protect their assets, engaging in ever more brazen intimidation of bank officials to prevent foreclosures, further corroding the financial system. The public psychology underwent a seismic and painful shift. The euphoria curdled into anger, the greed into bitter disillusionment. The search for scapegoats commenced, and the once tolerated Yakuza, now visibly linked to the nation's economic paralysis and political rot, were squarely in the crosshairs. A series of shocking scandals laid the corruption bare. The Sagawa-Cuban scandal revealed a nationwide trucking company with deep ties to the Yakuza funneling money to top LDP kingmaker Shin Kanemaru. The collapse of the housing loan corporations, Juzan, exposed billions in bad loans to Yakuza property speculators. The public's tacit social contract was null and void. This shift in sentiment enabled a legislative and social crackdown previously unimaginable. The 1991 Anti-Boryo-Kuden law was a revolution. It moved the fight from criminal acts to criminal associations. Police could now officially designate specific syndicates, publishing their names and crests. Crucially, it criminalized the payment of Mikajimirio, tribute, to a Yakuza boss, attacking their financial lifeblood. It also allowed victims and businesses to seek civil injunctions against Yakuza harassment. Subsequent laws made it illegal for gang members to open bank accounts, rent offices, or take out cell phone contracts in their own names. A nationwide movement, led by citizen groups and lawyers, promoted Boryo-Kuden Suho Undo, the movement to expel violent gangs. Businesses posted signs declaring their premises Yakuza-free. The state was no longer managing the Yakuza. It was engaged in societal ostracization aimed at their economic and social suffocation. The effect on the Yakuza was transformative and corrosive. Membership, which had peaked near 90,000 in the bubble years, began a steady decline, falling by more than half over the next 30 years. Recruitment became desperately difficult as the social stigma became overwhelming. The traditional codes of jinji, honor and duty, which had imposed a brutal but coherent internal discipline, eroded. The old Oyabun-Koban loyalty frayed. Younger members, less bound by these anachronistic rules, turned to more socially destructive and less structured crimes: methamphetamine trafficking, cybercrime fraud, identity theft, and smuggling. The organizations also fragmented, with splinter groups like the Kobe Yamaguchi-gumi breaking away and fighting bloody public wars over diminished territories and income streams. They were becoming less organized crime and more disorganized crime, posing a different, more chaotic kind of threat to public safety. Simultaneously, Japanese civil society began, tentatively, to reclaim the communal space the Yakuza had once occupied. After the Great Hanshin earthquake in 1995, it was volunteer groups, the self-defense forces, and ordinary citizens, not the Yakuza, who were the most prominent and effective first responders. This was repeated on a larger scale after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. While some Yakuza groups did distribute aid, often for publicity, their role was marginal compared to the organized civic response. This finally undermined the Yakuza's long-cultivated, self-serving image as protectors of the people and providers of social welfare. The philosophical and historical question that hangs over this entire century-long arc is profound and deeply uncomfortable. Did the Yakuza serve a necessary, if horrific, function? One must be exceedingly careful not to engage in moral relativism or romanticism. They were violent criminals who caused immense suffering. Yet, from a systems analysis perspective, in the Hobbesian void of 1945, they provided a crude, predatory form of social contract and basic security where the state had abdicated. During the economic miracle, they acted as the ruthless, flexible mechanism that solved the transaction cost problems of land and labor that the rigid, harmony-obsessed formal system could not solve on its own. They were, in a dark sense, a manifestation of core Japanese social principles: group loyalty, hierarchical obedience, and pragmatic, collective problem-solving, pushed into a criminal extreme and leveraged for profit. They were not an alien pathogen. They were a mutation of the host society's own DNA, flourishing in specific conditions of trauma, rapid change, and institutional weakness. The ultimate conclusion, however, is not one of ambivalence. The cost of this symbiosis was astronomical. A deeply corrupted political system that lasted for generations, a financial sector crippled by its own complicity, and a society that spent decades tacitly accepting a layer of institutionalized violence as the price of stability and prosperity. The Yakuza did not help rebuild Japan in any benevolent or noble sense. They acted as a predatory, adaptive force that filled functional gaps in a traumatized and rapidly transforming society. Their story is a stark, global cautionary tale about the compromises societies make in the name of order, growth, and the preservation of a harmonious facade. It forces us to scrutinize the line between institution and syndicate, between governance and racketeering, a line that can become perilously thin in the shadow of ruin or in the frenzy of creation. The legacy of the Yakuza's role challenges us to ask not only about Japan's past, but about the nature of social order itself, whether it springs purely from the light of law, an open consensus, or whether, in the deepest fractures of a civilization, it is sometimes from the shadows that the first, rough outlines of a new structure are drawn, a structure that must later be brought, painfully, into the light.